Queen Rania, thank you so much for joining us. What's been the impact of the pandemic on the world order, but also health inequality?
Well, basically, I think, this shared experience of this global pandemic has really emphasized for us our connectivity, but at the same time, it's reinforced and revealed some of the inequalities among us and some of the injustice in our world. So, we've seen this inequality expressed not just in terms of differences in income, but really inequality in education, health, job opportunity, upward mobility. And although we all had this experience in common, the way we experienced it was vastly different from group to group. So for some people, it was more of an inconvenience. It was more unsettling for them. But they still had the option to work from home, to move away from densely populated areas, to have access to healthcare. Whereas other people really, some of them couldn't even self-isolate because they were living from paycheck to paycheck. And therefore, they were reeling under parallel pandemics of hunger, violence, lack of education. And so extreme poverty has actually increased for the first time in 20 years. And it's become a vicious, destructive cycle where inequality has fueled the spread of the disease, and then the spread has created both health, economic, and education inequality that further fuels inequality. So I think the moment for radical change has arrived. Clearly the system is not working. I don't know if you know, but global debt this time in the middle of last year, both public, household, and corporate debt stood at 3 times global GDP. Not since World War II had advanced economies had that kind of debt. And the debt load has just increased because of the pandemic. And in a country like the United States, if you're born in a poor family, it takes about 5 generations to get to the average income in your society. So clearly our societies are reproducing, not reducing inequality. And so, inequality predates this pandemic and it will likely outlive it. And none of us are immune to the effects. So we need a full change. We need to imagine new socioeconomic systems that really give equality to everyone.
But Your Majesty, who's ready to do that? So if you look at the pandemic and the fact that actually it has set people back, it has set the poorest of the world back, we're talking about rebuilding better, but is there a real will from governments to rebuild a more equal society, or is it just happy talk?
Well, it could be just happy talk when we talk about that we need a more equitable, inclusive system. But to translate that from a utopian ideal to a practical reality, we need a change in 2 things, a change in mindset and a change in metrics. So, for the longest time, governments viewed GDP as the holy grail, but it really doesn't paint a holistic picture. GDP tells you about consumption, not well-being. It tells you about production, not pollution. It tells you how governments spend and invest, but it doesn't tell you about the state of our planet. So we need something that actually measures quality of life. We need to take a broader perspective, a longer-term view. So even in the private sector, it's not just about the next quarter or fiscal year. It needs to be a little bit more a longer-term view, and expanding and broadening the base of our stakeholders to include others. So, including new metrics is absolutely important. So non-financial metrics that measure the social and environmental imprint of a company, things like gender parity, greenhouse emissions, employee well-being, all those things are increasingly important.
Whose job is it to change capitalism? Is it governments? Is it financial operators? Or is it companies?
It's everybody, right? So as I said, the great thing is that I think this pandemic has been an impetus. When the world stood still and international travel was halted and global supply chains were disrupted and all of us, our movement was restricted, we all took some time to reassess our surroundings, ourselves, our personal as well as the state of our world. And clearly something is not working. The signs were there. We've seen protests and movements from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter to Me Too movements. And, you know, you may agree or not agree with some of these movements, but at the end of the day, they are calling out. They are warning signs that something needs to change in a very fundamental way. And even if you don't agree with somebody, you know, when you, in the face of something like this, it's better to approach it with a little bit of introspection and humility as opposed to downright rejection and condemnation. And so I think it's in everybody's vested interest, really, to see exactly how we can change those things. And like I said, there are practical ways of doing it. So companies, thankfully, are undergoing now there is a sustainability revolution underway right now. We're seeing companies embracing eco-efficiency and sustainability in record numbers. And as they start to recover from this pandemic, they need to make sure that this recovery, the color of it, is green, and that they sustain some of the practices that they instituted during the pandemic, like, for example, the option to work from home, which is more inclusive for a greater number of people.
What about the distribution of vaccines? So does vaccine nationalism, does vaccine hoarding actually just increase the health inequality gap?
Exactly. You know, like I said earlier, inequality manifests itself in so many ways, and health is definitely one of them. So even though vaccines are a global public good, we've seen that some countries, you know, they purchase enough doses to vaccinate their populations 3 times over, whereas many other countries have yet to start. Now, you know, moving forward, vaccine equity has to be a top priority. If it's not from an ethical or a moral standpoint, then it has to be from a self-interest standpoint. Because, you know, even if a wealthy country manages to reach herd immunity status because it has vaccinated a large number of its population, that status can easily be threatened by a mutation that can emerge from another country. So when we say none of us are safe until all of us are safe, that is not a platitude or a cliche. It's a reality. And for that reason, we need to make the long overdue investments in the public health infrastructure in the world so that it is more robust, more able to respond, contain, and monitor this and future pathogens in that may arise. At the end of the day, we are all in a race against a virus, not against each other. And until we are more inclusive, then we won't be able to beat it. This virus does not ask you what papers you hold before it decides to invade your body. So we need to treat everybody equally.
Do you think there will be a more vaccine, you know, a more equitable vaccine distribution once there are more doses? Will we actually be better prepared for the next pandemic?
Yes, I really hope so. You know, I think in the wake of a crisis, you either there's either chaos or clarity. And I hope that we have more clarity in our world on how to deal with this kind of situation. And in really understanding just the interconnectedness between us and the common vulnerability. You know, this is not an us versus them kind of scenario. And the polarization that we see in our world and the politicization of everything cannot apply anymore. Because, you know, like I said, if just one country does not reach immunity, then we are all under threat. So I think, as I said earlier, it's a matter of self-interest for all of us to make sure that everybody is in a good situation with this regard.
Your Majesty, you've also done a lot of work on keeping, you know, children and women in education. What have you learned through all of years of work on that?
Well, you know, this pandemic has been incredibly disruptive, but equal access to education was never equal or fair in the first place. But the disruptions that we're seeing today are causing disparities that are really quite astounding. You know, so in my region, for example, we have 1 out of 5 kids that were already out of school. During this pandemic, a full 40% of children were completely cut off from any kind of remote learning. And we have 2.2 million refugee children who could become further exposed to things like early child marriage, illegal labor practices, and extremist ideology if they're not safely back in school. So really what I've learned is that it is extremely important to invest in the hybridization of education. Now is the time to invest in both in-person and remote learning methodologies, and to actually prepare our educators to deliver on those effectively. You know, these methods are not just band-aid solutions to temporary problems. They truly can give us the opportunity, if delivered effectively, to equalize the quality of education for our kids, so that it's no longer dependent on how wealthy or well-connected their parents are or how impressive their zip codes are, but it's more about their own ability. So I think paying much more attention and making serious investments in the efficacy of remote learning methodologies so that we can combine them with in-person learning is absolutely important for our world.
And do you think the pandemic, after, I guess, making things much worse, will make things much better because people, governments, companies, individuals realize that this is really the basis of a good and strong civic society?
Well, you know, I think it all depends on how we come. None of us can predict the post-pandemic world and whether we have heeded the lessons that this pandemic has taught us. You know, this experience that we went through, as difficult as it was, maybe it's just a warning sign or a practice run for something more serious that can come in the future. So we would all do very well to learn lessons and to really stop, think, and as I said, this could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to fix many things that were long overdue, that we had ignored for too long, and to really find lasting solutions to them. You know, whether it's, like I said, education, health, our environment. You know, I think maybe one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that it has caused an awakening to the sense of urgency when it comes to dealing with our planet. And so that's something that's, I think, is a positive thing, and I hope that we can build on it and really come up with new metrics of how we measure our success. Everybody has a stake in this. Governments, the private sector, the investment community. Our world for too long has been excessively driven by short-term pressures. And we need to take a longer-term view, not just look at the next fiscal year, but look at the next generation, at the next decade, and think of, you know, the single-minded pursuit of profit. It has to be replaced by a longer-term view of value creation. I'm not saying that companies don't have a responsibility to create profit for their shareholders. They absolutely do. But they also need to maybe reimagine their products and services so that they add value, and they need to look at expanding their base, moving from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And, you know, so for example, stakeholders in the society should have a seat at the table when it comes to decisions concerning them. For too long, leadership committees were monocultural in terms of age, gender, education, jobs, race. So increasingly, I think boards and management teams should be more inclusive of people in their society, because that is actually a recipe for corporate success in the end.
You're almost advocating, Your Majesty, to actually change the financial and economic language in how we measure things. How have your conversations with stakeholders, with heads of government actually changed since the pandemic? It seems like more central banks are actually doing work in that direction. How do we measure, you know, the impact on the earth, inequality, and other ESGs?
Well, you know, for a very long time, there was talk and commitment about, you know, the need to infuse profit with purpose and to move from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. But, you know, now is the time to actually change this from aspirations to actions. More and more, this is about investing in the social capital. And businesses would do well to see their business success and their social success as one and the same, because this is the only path to acquire the most valuable and sought after and yet scarce ingredient for success, which is trust. You know, trust now, I don't think ever in the history has trust come at such a high premium, because it's been such short supply. There is a global deficit of trust. And consumers now, they don't want just the transactional relationships with the companies they work with. They want to know what these companies stand for. They're looking for authenticity. They know when a company is being genuine or when it's trying to greenwash its image or cash in on a trend. And so companies need to move away from just thinking, about, just like I said, profit cannot be the only bottom line for companies. So it's more about thinking of creating value. Corporate citizenship cannot just be about sort of isolated initiatives within the company. It needs to be part and parcel of the business model and ethos of doing business. So like I said, I think there is an impetus today, and I am seeing companies moving in that direction, as well as governments. And when you talk about measuring, there are measurements out there. So, for example, the World Economic Forum came up with a global competitiveness index, which actually helps companies really put those aspirations in actual numbers, so that we can see, so that things like social justice and sustainability can move from the bucket list onto the balance sheet, where we can assess them with clear metrics.
Your Majesty, what kind of advice would you give to a 20-year-old man or woman who wants to do good, who wants to go work for a company or work for government and wants to use their voice to better the world, but don't quite know how to use that voice yet?
Well, I think one of the things that's one of the negative things plaguing our world today, in addition to inequality, is the deep polarization that we're seeing. Everywhere you look, you see it everywhere, whether it's in the halls of power, on the news, and Twitter feeds. People just seem to be completely entrenched in their own points of view and are trapped in an us versus them mentality. And sometimes it just seems easier for people to score a point against a rival rather than to create a lasting win for everybody. And I think that is a problem in our world. This demonization of the other is really making us close in on ourselves and not see others as having any merit in their point of view. So my advice would be that, even if you think you're right, don't just resort to labels when you think of others. Actually explore the space in between their point of view and yours, because there's more than one right way to do the right thing or get the right results. I always call it the third way. And the third way is not just a compromise between two sides or two schools of thinking, but it's actually taking the best of both. So my advice to that young person would be, see the person that you disagree with, listen to them, and even if you disagree, you might at best just maybe take 5% of what they're saying. There can be a little bit of empathy, and that 5% can really get you those 5 steps closer to reaching a common ground.
Why do you think we're so polarized, and what will it take for actually to become much less polarized and I guess start talking to each other again?
Well, trust and polarization feed off one another, and this global, like I said, it's a global deficit of trust. People don't trust their governments, they don't trust business, they don't trust the media, and I don't want to blame social media for where the world is at, but I think a media ecosystem that elevates simple lies over complex truths and where clicks reward conflict over credibility certainly doesn't help. And in recent years, we've seen the upsurge of fake news, which has made it even more difficult for people to differentiate between fact and fiction. And that has led to a global information war. And the main victims of that war are trust and truth, which are the main cornerstones of any society. And so I think that is something that's really got us to this point. And when you have a social media environment like this one, I think it makes it tempting for leaders to become populist and just try to pander to the loudest voices and to seek universal approval. And that sometimes compromises the quality of the decisions, and sometimes it can handcuff them or make them do all the wrong things. Leadership has to be more principle and value driven rather than just pandering to what's going to make you the most popular in the short term. Again, it's about more internet integrity. We need better algorithms. We need better oversight. But at the end of the day, we need to upgrade ourselves digitally so that we are more resilient and so that our society is more immune to misinformation. I think misinformation has been a real issue. We know in the way we consume media and particularly social media, I think we need to have a healthy dose of skepticism and go that extra fact-checking mile, and also hold ourselves accountable for our digital footprint, what clicks we share, what videos we watch. We need to all hold ourselves accountable to the kind of impact we leave on the rest of the world.
Your Majesty, a final question. You've just actually also joined the Earthshot Prize Council. Why do prizes like that matter?
Well, I think this pandemic was a painful reminder of many things, mainly, that life is fragile, that changes to the status quo are inevitable, and that it's in all our best interest to heed the warnings and wisdom of science before it's too late. When lockdowns were put in place, it didn't take very long for us to feel some of the positive, albeit temporary effects. So, the fact that the air got cleaner, lower noise pollution, cleaner rivers. And when people breathe the cleaner air, they just didn't want to go back, and they shouldn't have to. Nature finally spoke, and finally we stood still long enough to actually heed the call and to listen. And so, I don't think the situation is hopeless, but it is incredibly urgent. And but humanity has shown that we have a knack for innovation whenever our backs are against the wall, and that's why I joined the Earthshot Prize with Prince William, who's a young man very passionate about improving the state of our environment. So this prize, in a nutshell, tries to support and scale initiative environmental solutions that hope to heal our climate in the next 10 years. I think there are positive signs. The fact that the U.S. is back in the Paris Climate Agreement, and the fact that China has committed to going carbon neutral by 2060 will hopefully get us on track. But again, as I said earlier, I think one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that it really caused an awakening to the urgency of the situation. So we're seeing governments, including green initiatives in their recovery plans, and companies becoming much more sustainable. Our earth, our ocean, our atmosphere do not read national borders. And so the only way to move forward is together.
Your Majesty, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you, Francine.